The Golden Awakening. The hardships of winter. The bitter winds of Montana's harsh winter cut through the gaps in the old barn, like invisible knives, carrying with them the promise of another brutal night ahead. Sam Crawford, pulled his worn woolen coat tighter around his shoulders as he arranged the hay bales that would serve as his bed for yet another evening. The 53-year-old rancher had made this uncomfortable arrangement his nightly routine for the past 3 months, ever since the wood supply had dwindled to dangerously low levels. Sam's ranch, nestled in the remote valleys of the Beartooth Mountains, had once been a thriving operation. His grandfather, Ezekiel Crawford, had established the homestead in 1882, building it from nothing but determination and backbreaking labor. The original log cabin, though modest, had been warm and comfortable, heated by a massive stone fireplace that could burn through half a cord of wood on the coldest nights. But those days of abundance seemed like distant memories now. The past 5 years had been particularly cruel to Sam. A series of harsh winters had decimated his cattle herd, reducing it from over 200 head to barely 30 surviving animals. The drought that followed had withered his hay crops, forcing him to sell off parcels of his land just to buy feed for the remaining livestock. Each setback had chipped away at his resources, his hope, and his ability to maintain the property that had been in his family for 3 generations. The decision to sleep in the barn hadn't been made lightly. Sam had calculated and recalculated his wood supply throughout the autumn, watching the pile shrink with each passing day. By November, it became clear that he had to make a choice: heat the house and risk running out of fuel entirely, or conserve what little wood remained for the most essential needs, cooking and keeping the water pipes from freezing. The barn, while far from comfortable, offered some advantages. The body heat from his remaining cattle provided a small amount of warmth, and the thick walls of hay bales he'd constructed around his makeshift sleeping area helped block the worst of the wind. More importantly, it allowed him to keep a small fire burning in the house, just enough to prevent the pipes from bursting, which would have been a catastrophe he couldn't afford to repair. As Sam settled into his nest of hay and old blankets, he reflected on the series of misfortunes that had brought him to this point. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 7 years earlier from pneumonia, leaving him to manage the ranch alone. Their only son, Michael, had moved to Denver after college, pursuing a career in banking that seemed as foreign to Sam as life on Mars. Michael sent money when he could, but it was never enough to truly make a difference, and Sam's pride prevented him from asking for more substantial help. The isolation of winter made everything worse. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, and the town of Bear Creek was a 20-mile journey over treacherous mountain roads that became impassable during heavy snowfall. Sam often went weeks without seeing another human being, surviving on canned goods, dried beans, and the occasional rabbit he managed to trap. Tonight felt particularly lonely as Sam listened to the wind howling outside the barn. The temperature had dropped below 0, and even wrapped in every blanket he owned, he could feel the cold seeping into his bones. His arthritis, a souvenir from decades of hard physical labor, etched with each gust of wind that rattled the barn doors. As he lay there, Sam's mind wandered to the stories his grandfather used to tell about the early days of the ranch. Ezekiel had been a man of few words, but on winter evenings he would sometimes share tales of the hardships he'd faced while establishing the homestead. There had been stories of wolves, blizzards that lasted for weeks, and winters so harsh that even the strongest men questioned their decision to settle in such an unforgiving land. But the land gives back to those who treat her right, Ezekiel used to say, his weathered hands gesturing toward the mountains that surrounded their valley. She tests you first, pushes you to your limits, but if you prove yourself worthy, she'll reward your patience. Sam had always assumed those words referred to the eventual prosperity the ranch had enjoyed during his father's time, when cattle prices were high and the weather more predictable. But lying in the cold barn, struggling to survive another winter. He wondered if his grandfather's optimism had been misplaced. The cattle shifted restlessly in their stalls, their breathing creating small clouds of vapor in the frigid air. Sam found some comfort in their presence. At least he wasn't completely alone. His old border collie, Rex, had passed away the previous spring, leaving him without even the companionship of a dog. He'd considered getting another, but the cost of feeding an additional mouth seemed irresponsible given his circumstances. As the night deepened, Sam pulled his hat down over his ears and tried to find a comfortable position among the high boughs. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the creaking of the barn and the occasional lowing of the cattle. In his dreams, he was a young man again, working alongside his father during the ranch's prosperous years, when the future seemed bright and full of possibilities. He dreamed of Margaret, too, her laughter echoing through the warm kitchen of their home as she prepared meals for the ranch hands during roundup season. In the dream, the house was full of life and warmth, the fireplace crackling merrily, while snow fell gently outside the windows. It was a beautiful dream, but waking up in the cold barn made the contrast all the more painful. The first hint of dawn came as a gray light filtering through the gaps in the barn walls. Sam's body ached from sleeping on the uneven surface, and his breath formed white clouds in the frigid air. Another night survived, another day to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As he prepared to rise and begin his morning chores, Sam couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about this particular morning. Perhaps it was the quality of the light, or the way the wind had died down to an unusual stillness. But there was an expectancy in the air that he couldn't quite explain. Little did he know that this morning would mark the beginning of the most extraordinary chapter of his life, one that would validate his grandfather's faith in the land's ability to reward those who endured its trials. The discovery. Sam's morning routine had become as predictable as the sunrise itself. Despite the discomfort of sleeping in the barn, he always rose before dawn to check on his cattle and begin the day's essential tasks. This particular morning, however, something felt distinctly different from the moment he opened his eyes. The first thing he noticed was the unusual warmth beneath him. Throughout the winter, the ground in the barn had been consistently frozen, making his makeshift bed feel like sleeping on stone. But this morning, the earth seemed to radiate a gentle heat that penetrated through the high-end blankets. Sam initially attributed this to his imagination, or perhaps a change in the weather, but as he became more fully awake, he realized the sensation was too pronounced to dismiss. Sitting up slowly, his joints protesting after another night on the hard ground, Sam noticed that the height directly beneath where he'd been sleeping appeared different. In the dim morning light filtering through the barn's weathered boards, he could see what looked like a faint, golden shimmer among the dried grass stalks. He rubbed his eyes, certain that fatigue and the cold were playing tricks on his vision. But the shimmer remained. Curious now, Sam began moving the eye aside with his hand, expecting to find nothing more than the familiar dirt floor of the barn. Instead, his fingers encountered something that made his heart skip a beat. Mixed in with the soil were small, irregular chunks of what appeared to be metal, gleaming with an unmistakably golden hue. "What in the hell?" Sam muttered, his voice hoarse as from the cold night air. He scrambled to his feet and hurried to the barn's entrance, throwing open the large doors to let in more light. The morning sun, just cresting the mountains to the east, sent brilliant rays streaming across the barn floor. In that enhanced illumination, there was no mistaking what he was seeing. Gold. Actual gold nuggets, some as small as peas, others as large as walnuts, scattered throughout the dirt where he'd been sleeping. Sam's hands trembled as he knelt down and picked up one of the larger pieces. It was heavy, much heavier than its size would suggest, and it had the distinctive color and luster that he'd seen in photographs and museums. But how was this possible? He'd been sleeping in this same spot for months, and there had never been any sign of precious metal in the soil. As he examined the area more carefully, Sam realized that the gold wasn't just sitting on the surface. It appeared to be emerging from deeper in the earth, as if something underground was pushing it upward. The soil itself seemed different too, looser, darker, and warmer than it had been before. With growing excitement and disbelief, Sam ran to the house to retrieve a shovel and a lantern. His arthritis was forgotten as adrenaline coursed through his veins. If this was real, if there was actually gold on his property, it could change everything. Back in the barn, Sam began to dig carefully in the spot where he'd been sleeping. With each shovelful of earth he removed, more gold appeared, not just small flakes or dust, but substantial nuggets that gleamed in the lantern light like captured sunshine. The deeper he dug, the more he found, until he had excavated a hole nearly 3 feet deep and 2 feet wide. By mid-morning, Sam had collected enough gold to fill a large coffee can. He's back actually from the unaccustomed digging, but he couldn't stop. Each new discovery sent fresh waves of excitement through his tired body. This wasn't just a few scattered pieces, this was a genuine deposit, possibly extending far beyond the small area he'd explored. As he paused to catch his breath, Sam's mind raced with questions and possibilities. How long had this gold been here? Why was it appearing now, after all these years? His grandfather had worked this land for decades, and his father after him. Surely they would have noticed signs of precious metal if it had been present before. Then Sam remembered something his grandfather had told him years ago, a story he dismissed as an old man's tall tale. Ezekiel had claimed that the original homestead had been built over what the local Native Americans called sleeping earth, ground that they believed held great power, but would only reveal its secrets to those who had proven themselves worthy through hardship and perseverance. At the time, some had assumed it was just frontier folklore, the kind of mystical thinking that often developed in isolated communities. But now, staring at the coffee can full of gold nuggets, he wondered if there might have been more truth to the old stories than he'd ever imagined. The practical implications of his discovery began to sink in as the initial shock wore off. If this gold deposit was as extensive as it appeared to be, it could solve all of his financial problems. It could pay off the mortgage on the ranch, repair the buildings, restock his cattle herd, and even hire help for the heavy work that was becoming increasingly difficult for his aging body. But Sam was also aware that such a discovery would bring complications. Word of gold had a way of spreading quickly, and he'd heard stories of prospectors and mining companies descending on small properties like locusts, often using legal maneuvers or outright intimidation to gain control of valuable claims. For now, he decided discretion was essential. He needed to understand the full extent of the deposit and secure his legal rights before anyone else learned of the discovery. Sam carefully refilled the hole, spreading fresh eye over the disturbed earth to conceal any evidence of his digging. He carried the coffee can of gold nuggets to the house, his mind already working on plans for the next steps. First, he would need to have some of the gold assayed to confirm its purity and value. Then he would need to research mining rights and regulations, possibly consult with a lawyer who specialized in mineral rights. As Sam sat at his kitchen table, examining the golden nuggets in the warmth of his small wood fire, he felt a profound sense of gratitude mixed with bewilderment. After years of struggle, of sleeping in a cold barn to conserve fuel, of watching his family's legacy slowly crumble around him, fortune had literally emerged from the ground beneath his feet. The irony wasn't lost on him that his decision to sleep in the barn, a choice born of desperation and hardship, had led directly to this miraculous discovery. If he had continued sleeping in the house, he never would have been lying on the exact spot where the gold was emerging from the earth. Outside, the winter wind continued to blow, but for the first time in years, Sam felt worn from the inside out. The land had indeed rewarded his patience and perseverance, just as his grandfather had promised it would. The question now was what he would do with this unexpected gift, and how he would protect it from those who might try to take it away. The transformation. Word of Sam's discovery spread through Bear Creek like wildfire, despite his best efforts to keep it secret. It started innocently enough when he drove to town to have several nuggets assayed at the local bank. The assayer, Kim Morrison, had been a friend of Sam's father and was known for his discretion, but the sight of genuine gold nuggets in rural Montana was too extraordinary to keep completely quiet. Within a week, Sam found himself dealing with visitors he'd never expected to see on his remote ranch. First came the curious neighbors, then the local newspaper reporter, followed by representatives from mining companies who had somehow caught wind of the discovery. Each day brought new challenges as Sam tried to navigate the sudden attention. While protecting his interests, the assay results had been even better than Sam had dared to hope. The gold was of exceptional purity, nearly 95% pure, and the nuggets he'd brought to town were worth over $15,000. If the deposit extended as far as his preliminary excavation suggested, he could be sitting on a fortune worth millions. But with the good news came complications that Sam hadn't anticipated. A representative from Consolidated Mining Corporation arrived at his ranch on a snowy Thursday morning, driving an expensive SUV that looked out of place on the rough mountain roads. The man, who introduced himself as Richard Blackwood, wore a tailor suit and carried a briefcase that probably cost more than Sam's truck. "Crawford," Blackwood said, settling into a chair at Sam's kitchen table without being invited. "I'm here to discuss a business proposition that could benefit us both." Sam poured himself a cup of coffee but didn't offer any to his uninvited guest. "I'm listening." Consolidated Mining has extensive experience in extracting precious metals from properties like yours. We have the equipment, the expertise, and the capital to properly develop this resource. In exchange for mining rights, we're prepared to offer you a very generous lease agreement. The offer was indeed substantial, $1 million signing bonus plus a percentage of the extracted gold's value. To a man who had been sleeping in a barn to save firewood just weeks earlier, it seemed like an impossible sum of money. But Sam had been doing his homework. He'd consulted with a lawyer in Billings who specialized in mineral rights, and he learned that his property rights included everything beneath the surface. More important, it discovered that the gold deposit appeared to be what geologists called a placer deposit, gold that had been naturally concentrated by water action over thousands of years, making it relatively easy to extract without the massive industrial operations that hard rock mining required. "He appreciated the offer, Mr. Blackwood," Sam said carefully, "but I'm not ready to make any decisions yet. I need to understand exactly what I'm dealing with before I sign anything." Blackwood's friendly demeanor shifted slightly. "Miss Crawford, I hope you understand that operating a mining claim isn't something a man can do alone. The regulations, the environmental requirements, the equipment costs, it's a complex business that requires significant expertise and capital." "Maybe so," Sam replied, "but it's my land, and I'll decide what happens on it." After Blackwood left, Sam felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The mining company's interest confirmed that his discovery was significant, but their eagerness to secure rights also suggested that he might be sitting on something even more valuable than he'd realized. Over the following weeks, Sam continued his careful excavation of the gold deposit. Working alone and using hand tools to avoid attracting attention, he gradually mapped the extent of the find. The gold-bearing soil extended in a rough oval shape covering nearly 2 acres, with the richest concentrations in the area where he'd originally been sleeping. The physical work was exhausting for a man his age, but Sam found that his years of ranch labor had prepared him well for the demands of small-scale mining. He developed a system for washing the gold-bearing soil in a series of screens and pans, separating the precious metal from the dirt and gravel. Each day's work yielded between 1 and 3 ounces of gold, worth roughly $2,000 to $6,000 at current market prices. As his pile of gold and nuggets grew, so did Sam's confidence in his ability to work the claim independently. He purchased better equipment, a small sluice box, a high-pressure washer, and a portable generator to power his operations. The irony of his situation wasn't lost on him. He was now spending more on equipment in a week than he'd previously been able to afford in a year. The transformation of Sam's circumstances was remarkable. Within 2 months of his discovery, he had extracted enough gold to pay off the ranch's mortgage and fund significant improvements to the property. He hired a crew to repair the barn's roof, installed a new heating system in the house, and even bought a new truck to replace his aging pickup. But perhaps the most significant change was in Sam himself. The constant worry about money that had plagued him for years was gone, replaced by a sense of purpose and excitement that he hadn't felt since his youth. He was no longer just surviving, he was thriving. The news of his success reached his son Michael in Denver, who called with a mixture of congratulation and concern. "Dad, I'm happy for you, but I'm also worried. There are a lot of people who might try to take advantage of you. Have you thought about hiring security or maybe moving the gold to a bank vault?" Sam had indeed thought about security, but he decided that the remote location of his ranch was protection enough for now. He'd invested in a good safe and had taken precautions to conceal the extent of his operation from casual observers. More importantly, he'd learned to trust his instincts about people, and he was careful about who he allowed onto his property. The winter that had begun with Sam sleeping in a cold barn to save firewood was ending with him as one of the wealthiest men in the county. But wealth, it was discovering, brought its own set of challenges and responsibilities. Mining companies continued to contact him with increasingly aggressive offers. Local politicians suddenly took an interest in his welfare, offering assistance with permits and regulations that he hadn't asked for. Even some of his neighbors, who had barely acknowledged his existence during his years of struggle, now appeared at his door with friendly visits and subtle hints about loans or investments. Through it all, Sam remained focused on the work itself. Each morning, he would walk out to his mining operation with the same sense of anticipation he'd once felt as a young man checking on newborn calves. The gold was still there, still emerging from the earth, as if the land itself was eager to share its long-hidden treasures. As the spring approached and the snow began to melt in the mountain valleys, Sam reflected on the extraordinary turn his life had taken. The hardships of the previous winter seemed like a distant memory, but he hadn't forgotten the lessons they'd taught him about perseverance and self-reliance. The land had indeed rewarded his patience, just as his grandfather had promised. But Sam was beginning to understand that the real treasure wasn't just the gold itself. It was the opportunity to rebuild his life and secure his family's legacy for future generations. Legacy and revelation. As the spring melted into summer, Sam's mining operation had evolved into a sophisticated but still manageable enterprise. He had extracted over 200 ounces of gold, worth more than $400,000 at current market prices. But more importantly, la lack de servir commissioned indicated that the deposit was far from exhausted. Conservative estimates suggested that the placer could yield gold for decades to come, potentially making Sam one of the wealthiest individuals in Montana. The transformation of the Crawford Ranch was remarkable to behold. The once struggling property now hummed with activity as Sam invested his newfound wealth back into the land his family had worked for generations. New fencing stretched across pastures that would soon be restocked with premium cattle. The old barn, where Sam had made his life-changing discovery, had been completely renovated, its roof repaired and its walls reinforced. Most significantly, the main house had been restored to its original grandeur, with modern amenities that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the return of family to the ranch. Michael had taken a leave of absence from his banking job in Denver to help his father manage the sudden wealth and the complex legal and business decisions that came with it. For the first time in years, the ranch felt like a true home again, filled with the sounds of conversation and planning for the future. "Dad," Michael said, one evening, as they sat on the newly rebuilt front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold that seemed particularly appropriate. "I've been thinking about what Grandpa Ezekiel used to say about the land rewarding those who proved themselves worthy." Sam nodded, sipping from a glass of whiskey that was considerably better than anything he'd been able to afford during his lean years. "I've been thinking about that too. For a long time, I thought he was just being optimistic, maybe even a little foolish. But now I wonder if he knew something we didn't. Or maybe the land really does have a way of testing people, seeing how much they can endure before it decides to help them." Michael was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Do you ever wonder why the gold appeared when it did? I mean, you'd been working this land for decades. Why didn't it show up earlier?" It was a question that had puzzled Sam as well. The geological surveys had confirmed that the gold deposit was ancient, formed over thousands of years by water action that had concentrated the precious metal in the area where he'd been sleeping. But there was no scientific explanation for why it had suddenly become accessible at the exact moment when Sam needed it most. "I've got a theory about that," Sam said slowly. "Remember how I told you the ground felt warm that morning when I first found the gold? Well, I've been keeping track of the temperature in that area, and it's consistently warmer than the surrounding soil. The geologists can't explain it, but I think something shifted underground during that particularly cold winter. Maybe the freeze-thaw cycle. Maybe some kind of seismic activity we didn't notice. Whatever it was, it brought the gold closer to the surface, right where I happened to be sleeping. That's quite a coincidence. Maybe. Or maybe Grandpa was right about the land having its own way of doing things." As summer progressed, Sam faced new challenges that came with his changing circumstances. The mining operation required careful environmental management to comply with state regulations. He hired consultants to ensure that his extraction methods didn't damage the local ecosystem, and he invested in restoration projects for areas that had been disturbed by his work. The tension from mining companies had intensified as well. Consolidated Mining had increased their offer to $5 million for a long-term lease, and other companies were making similar proposals. The pressure was significant, but Sam had learned to value his independence above all else. "They keep telling me I can't manage this operation alone," he told Michael one day, as they watched the crew installing new equipment at the mining site. "But I'm not alone anymore. I've got good people helping me, and I've got you here to handle the business side of things." Michael had indeed proven invaluable in managing the complex financial and legal aspects of the operation. His banking background had prepared him well for dealing with contracts, regulations, and investment decisions. More importantly, his presence had given Sam someone he could trust completely in a world where trust had become a precious commodity. The discovery had also brought unexpected reconnections with the past. Sam's elderly neighbor, Martha Henderson, had visited one afternoon with a surprising revelation. Her late husband had been friends with Ezekiel Crawford, and she remembered conversations about unusual properties of the land around Sam's ranch. "Your grandfather used to say that the Native Americans who lived here before the settlers arrived had stories about that particular valley," Martha told Sam as they sat in his newly furnished living room. "They called it the place where the earth dreamed, and they believed that those dreams could become real for people who had earned the right to see them." Did he believe those stories? I think he did, though he never said so directly. But he always maintained that the land would provide for his family if they treated it with respect and didn't give up when times got hard. As autumn approached, marking nearly a year since Sam's discovery, he reflected on the profound changes in his life. The financial security was wonderful, of course, but the real transformation went much deeper. He had rediscovered his sense of purpose and his connection to the land that had sustained his family for generations. The mining operation had settled into a sustainable rhythm that allowed Sam to extract gold while maintaining the ranch's traditional cattle operation. They had restocked his herd with premium breeding stock, and the combination of mining income and livestock profits promised to make the ranch profitable for generations to come. But perhaps most importantly, Sam had learned to see his earlier hardships in a new light. The years of struggle, the nights sleeping in a cold barn, the constant worry about money, all of it had led to this moment of discovery and transformation. Without those trials, he never would have been in the right place, at the right time to find the gold that had been waiting beneath his feet. One evening, as the first snow of winter began to fall, Sam walked out to the barn where his journey had begun. The building was warm now, properly heated and insulated, but he could still remember the bitter cold of that morning when he'd first noticed the golden shimmer in the hay. Standing in the spot where he'd made his discovery, Sam felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the gold, but for the entire journey that had brought him to this point. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. The land gives back to those who treat her right. As he walked back to the house, where Michael was waiting with plans for the next phase of their operation, Sam realized that the true treasure hadn't been the gold itself. It had been the reminder that perseverance, respect for the land, and faith in the future could overcome even the most difficult circumstances. The lonely rancher who had slept in a barn to save wood had indeed awakened on a bed of gold. But more than that, he had awakened to a new understanding of his place in the world and his responsibility to the land that had sustained his family for over a century. The gold would eventually run out, Sam knew, but the lessons he'd learned and the legacy he was building would endure long after the last nugget had been extracted from the earth. And perhaps, someday, another member of the Crawford family would face their own trials and discover that the land still had gifts to offer to those who proved themselves worthy of receiving them. The